The sun was just beginning to rise over Ouagadougou, casting a golden light over the dusty streets. People moved quietly through the markets, their faces filled with a mixture of hope and worry. The city was tense. Something was changing, and everyone could feel it in the air. Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat behind a heavy wooden desk in the presidential office. Though still young, his face was serious, his eyes sharp. He had taken power in a time of great unrest, promising to protect his country from danger, both inside and out. Now he was facing a new challenge, one that came not from rebels in the north, but from men in suits and polished shoes. His advisors had brought troubling reports. French diplomats were holding late-night meetings with certain Burkina officials. Money was moving in secret. Some army officers had suddenly become very quiet, or too talkative in strange ways. Rumors floated through the military like smoke. There might be a plan to weaken the government from within. Traoré didn't trust easily. He had learned that trust could get you killed. So instead of reacting in anger, he decided to watch and wait. For weeks, his intelligence team followed movements, traced phone calls, and listened to whispers in the hallways of power. Every night, they came back with more information. Each piece of the puzzle showed something darker, something more dangerous. One day, his lead intelligence officer entered the room with a folder under his arm. His expression said everything before he even spoke. "Mr. President," he said quietly, placing the folder on the desk. "It's more than we thought." Traoré opened the folder and scanned the pages. Times, names, locations. French diplomats meeting with certain Burkina commanders in quiet cafes. Unregistered vehicles entering the French embassy late at night. A strange signal picked up near a military base, coded in a way only foreign operatives used. It was enough to raise serious alarms. Outside, the streets of Ouagadougou grew louder. People protested near foreign buildings. Flags were burned. Crowds chanted for independence, for control, for Burkina Faso to belong to its own people again. The pressure was growing, and Traoré knew he had to act before it exploded. He picked up the phone and made a quiet call. His voice was calm but firm. "Arrange a meeting," he said, "with the French chargé d'affaires. I want to see him here, alone." His advisors looked at each other nervously. Everyone knew what this meant. Confronting a foreign diplomat was no small thing. It could mean broken alliances. It could mean economic punishment. It could even mean something worse, something hidden. But Traoré didn't hesitate. He stood up, closed the folder, and looked out the window at the city below. Ouagadougou was not just a capital, it was a symbol, and he had sworn to protect it. The date was set. The meeting would happen soon. And Traoré, calm on the outside but burning inside, prepared for the moment that could change everything. A black car rolled up slowly to the gates of the presidential palace. The guards checked everything carefully, their eyes sharp and alert. Inside the car sat the French chargé d'affaires, a tall man in a dark suit with thin glasses and a briefcase resting on his lap. His face looked calm, but his fingers tapped nervously on the leather handle. He knew this meeting was not just a formality. Ibrahim Traoré waited inside the main hall. The room was quiet, the air heavy. There were no decorations, no smiling photos, no signs of welcome. Just a long wooden table, 2 chairs, and silence. His advisors were told to stay outside. This was going to be a private conversation, man to man. The French diplomat was led inside. He gave a polite nod and tried to smile, but Traoré didn't return it. He motioned to the chair across from him. "Sit," Traoré said simply. They sat facing each other. Between them, only a glass of water and a thin folder lay on the table. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, without any soft introductions, Traoré spoke. "I know what's been happening," he said quietly. "I know about the meetings, the messages, the unmarked cars. We have proof." The diplomat's smile faded. His hands stopped moving. "Mr. President," he said in a calm voice, "you must understand, we are here to support Burkina Faso. We have nothing to hide. Traoré opened the folder and slowly slid a paper across the table. It showed a list of times and places, private meetings between the Diplomat staff and Burkina officers. Then he showed a photo. A French embassy car parked outside a secret location late at night. The Diplomat looked down at the papers. His face tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "These are misunderstandings," he said. "Diplomats meet people. We work with the military to help." Traoré cut him off. "Not in secret," he said firmly. "Not with men who are already under investigation. Not without informing our office. This is not help. This is interference." The room went silent again. Only the ticking of a clock on the far wall could be heard. The Diplomat leaned back slightly in his chair. "Are you accusing the French Republic of working against your government?" he asked. Traoré didn't blink. "I am saying," he answered, "that if you are not working with us, then you are working against us." The Diplomat's mouth opened, then closed. He had no answer for that. Traoré stood up. "This meeting is over," he said. "From now on, every movement of your team will be watched. Every meeting must be reported. Any step taken in secret will be treated as an act of aggression." Guards entered the room, not with weapons raised, but their presence was clear. The Diplomat stood slowly. He nodded stiffly and walked out without another word. Once the door closed, Traoré stayed standing. He didn't speak. He just looked out the window, where the Burkina flag waved in the wind. He had taken the first step, and there was no turning back. It wasn't long before the news of the meeting spread across Ouagadougou. Whispers filled the streets, the markets, even the small cafes. People talked of the strong words exchanged between Ibrahim Traoré and the French diplomat. Some feared that the relationship between Burkina Faso and France might be over. Others were hopeful. Maybe this was the moment for true independence. But the real test came the next day. The French diplomat arrived at the presidential palace again, this time with a different tone. His usual calm was gone. Now he looked uneasy, his shoulders tense, his jaw tight. He knew this wouldn't be a normal diplomatic meeting. Ibrahim Traoré was waiting, his face unreadable. He motioned for the diplomat to sit down, just as he had done before. But there was no polite greeting this time, only a sharp look that made the diplomat nervous. "I want answers," Traoré said, his voice cold. "You came here yesterday and tried to deny everything. But I know what's going on. We have the proof." The diplomat shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping the table nervously. "I told you already," he said, trying to sound calm. "There's nothing to hide. We've been working to help the government stabilize the country. That's all." "Help," Traoré repeated. His eyes narrowed. "Is that what you call it? Your government has been talking to my soldiers in secret, planning behind our backs. You have been moving money, weapons, and other things without our permission. You think we don't know?" The diplomat's face changed. He stood up suddenly, as if trying to gain control of the situation. "This is outrageous. We have always helped Burkina Faso. We've been partners for years. How can you accuse us of what?" Traoré interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "Of betrayal, of stealing our future, of making deals with men who are loyal to foreign powers instead of their own country. You've been using your position to manipulate and control, and now it's time to stop." The diplomat's face turned red. He took a deep breath, trying to stay composed, but he was losing his grip. "This is not how we do things," he said, his voice sharp. "You are making a big mistake, Traoré. France will not stand by and let this happen. France will stand by and do nothing," Traoré said, his voice steady but strong. "Because we are no longer afraid. You think you can pull the strings in Burkina Faso, that we would let you continue to treat us like a puppet? No, you've crossed the line." The two men stared at each other in silence. The air felt thick, heavy, as if something huge was about to happen. The diplomat opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Traoré stood up abruptly. "I've had enough of this. You are to leave now," Traoré said firmly. "You'll regret this," the diplomat hissed, before turning and walking quickly to the door. As he left, the guards stood at attention, their eyes sharp as ever. The diplomat didn't look back. Traoré stood there for a moment, watching the door close. His heart was racing, but his mind was clear. This was no longer about accusations or words. This was about strength, about showing the world that Burkina Faso would no longer be controlled by outside powers. He turned and walked to his desk, feeling the weight of what had just happened. The tension was far from over, but in that moment, Ibrahim Traoré knew one thing for certain. His country was no longer weak. It was no longer afraid. The days after the confrontation with the French diplomat were filled with tension, but also determination. Ibrahim Traoré knew that the stakes were high, and his next move could change everything. He had no intention of backing down, but he needed more than just suspicions and photographs. He needed solid evidence to expose what was happening behind the scenes. One evening, as Traoré sat in his office, reviewing reports, a knock came at the door. It was his trusted intelligence officer, the man who had helped uncover the first signs of trouble. But this time, the officer wasn't alone. Behind him stood a nervous-looking man in his 30s, wearing a simple shirt and trousers. His eyes darted around the room, unsure of what to expect. "Sir, this is Malik," the officer said quietly. He used to work as a security guard at the French embassy. Traoré stood up and motioned for Malik to sit. The young man hesitated but then took the seat across from him. His hands were shaking slightly. "Malik has important information, sir," the officer continued. "He says he knows what has been happening at the embassy. He's seen things no one should have seen." The young man took a deep breath and began speaking in a low voice, his words slow but heavy. "I'd worked at the embassy for 2 years, Malik said. "I wasn't allowed to know everything, but I saw things, strange things. Late-night meetings, people coming and going in the dark. They didn't want anyone to notice, but I did. And I heard them talking about plans, about influencing the military here, making sure certain leaders stayed in power." He paused, his eyes flickering nervously toward the door. "They weren't just talking about helping the government," Malik continued. "They were talking about controlling it, pushing certain people out and bringing in others who would follow orders from France." Traoré listened carefully, his face a mask of concentration. The words were disturbing, but not surprising. It seemed like everything was falling into place. Malik was speaking from his heart, and it was clear he felt a deep sense of guilt for what he had seen. "I didn't know who to trust," Malik said, his voice shaking now. "But when I saw how you stood up to that diplomat, I knew I had to come forward. I couldn't stay silent anymore." Traoré leaned forward, his eyes locking with Malik's. "Do you have proof?" he asked firmly. Malik nodded, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small, thin USB drive. "I copied everything I could," he said. "Emails, security footage, messages, all of it. It's all on here." The room fell silent. Traoré took the USB drive and studied it for a moment before placing it carefully on the table. "Thank you, Malik," he said. "You've done the right thing. We will make sure this information is used properly. You are safe now." Malik nodded, but he still looked uneasy. "What will happen now?" he asked. Traoré stood up and turned toward the window, looking out at the city that stretched before him. His voice was calm, but full of purpose. "We will expose the truth," he said. "The world needs to know what has been happening, but we will do it carefully. We have to be smart. If we move too quickly, we risk everything. But if we wait too long, it might be too late." As Malik left the room, Traoré sat back down at his desk, staring at the USB drive. This was the moment he had been waiting for. With this new information, he could finally prove the extent of the manipulation and interference. The truth was in his hands. But he knew the risks. The battle was just beginning. And no matter how strong he felt, there would be no easy path ahead. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Ibrahim Traoré knew the information Malik had given him was critical, but he also understood the importance of being careful. The world was watching, and one wrong move could change everything. The French government would not sit back quietly. He needed to make sure the truth was exposed in the right way. In his office, late one night, Traoré sat with his most trusted team of advisors. The room was dimly lit, and the only sound was the soft clicking of the laptop as one of his officers plugged in Malik's USB drive. A tense silence filled the room as the files began to open. It was clear from the beginning that this wasn't just a few innocent mistakes. This was something much bigger. The first set of documents was filled with messages, emails, and coded communication between the French embassy and Burkina military officers. Words like control, influence, and plan appeared over and over again. There were also lists of names, military officers who had secretly met with French diplomats and agreed to certain actions. The patterns were clear. A network of influence had been built to manipulate the country's military and government. But it wasn't just the documents that caught their attention. There was something even more shocking hidden in the files: security footage from the embassy's cameras. The officers played it on the screen, and the room fell silent again as images of late-night meetings appeared. In the footage, a Burkina officer, dressed in civilian clothes, was seen entering the French embassy under the cover of darkness. He wasn't alone. Other men, some with faces hidden, followed him inside. They didn't look like diplomats. They looked like military personnel, men whose loyalties were to a foreign power, not their own country. The footage showed them entering and leaving the building at odd hours, always avoiding public attention. Sometimes the meetings were short, and other times they lasted for hours. One particular meeting stood out. It showed a group of officers sitting around a table, speaking quietly, looking over maps, and shaking hands. On the table were documents and a laptop. No one knew exactly what was being discussed, but the body language was clear. These men weren't talking about peace or cooperation. They were talking about control. As the footage played on, more shocking images appeared. There were times when crates were loaded into unmarked vehicles late at night, crates that looked suspiciously like they were filled with weapons. It was impossible to ignore. This wasn't just political influence. This was something much darker. Traoré's team watched in disbelief. They had all suspected that something was wrong, but seeing it with their own eyes made the threat real. This was no longer a simple diplomatic disagreement. It was a conspiracy to destabilize the country from within. One of the advisors turned to Traoré, his face pale. "This is bigger than we thought," he said quietly. "We can't just expose this and expect everything to go back to normal. We need to be careful how we move forward." Traoré nodded, his eyes fixed on the screen. "We will be careful, but we will also be firm. The truth will come out, and when it does, no one will be able to deny it." He paused for a moment, considering the next steps. Exposing this kind of corruption wouldn't be easy. The French government would fight back, and the country's allies might hesitate to support him. But Traoré was no stranger to danger. He had already faced so much to get to this point. And now, with the evidence in his hands, he was ready to fight for his country's future. "Prepare a plan to release the footage," he said finally. "But we do it on our terms. We control the narrative. We show the world what is really happening." His team nodded, and the room began to buzz with quiet activity as they prepared to expose the truth. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Ibrahim Traoré was no longer a man who would bow to foreign powers. He would do whatever it took to protect his country. And the world would soon know the truth. As the days passed, the plan to reveal the truth slowly began to take shape. Ibrahim Traoré knew he couldn't just release the footage without thinking carefully about the consequences. If they moved too quickly, it could create chaos. If they waited too long, The people in power who were trying to control Burkina Faso might cover their tracks. His team worked day and night, carefully preparing a statement, planning media coverage, and deciding on the right moment to show the world what had been happening behind closed doors. Traoré knew that the truth, once out in the open, would shake everything. It would change the way the world viewed Burkina Faso and possibly spark a larger confrontation with France. One morning, Traoré gathered his closest advisors in a small meeting room. The tension in the room was thick, everyone feeling the weight of what was about to happen. "We're ready," one of his advisors said, looking at the large screen at the front of the room. "We have the footage, the statement, and a list of international news outlets ready to broadcast everything at the same time." Traoré nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "This will be a turning point, but we must stay united. We cannot let fear stop us now." He turned to the group of advisors, who all understood the gravity of the situation. "When we release this, we show strength, not just to the people of Burkina Faso, but to the world." The plan was set in motion. Everything was prepared, and the moment to act had come. At noon the next day, news outlets from around the world would broadcast the footage. It would be everywhere, on television, social media, in newspapers, and through every possible channel. The hours leading up to the release were filled with anticipation. People in Burkina Faso had already begun to talk. Rumors swirled in the markets, in homes, on street corners. Some believed it was time for their country to take control of its future, while others feared what might happen next. There was no telling how the world would react. But in the midst of all the uncertainty, Ibrahim Traoré felt a calm resolve. He knew that what he was about to do was right. No matter the outcome, the truth would be out, and the people of Burkina Faso would see that their country was no longer a pawn in the hands of others. As the clock ticked toward noon, the footage was uploaded to multiple international news channels, and a statement from Traoré was broadcast live. The video began with the shocking footage of the meetings at the French embassy, followed by images of Burkinabe officers involved in secret activities. The world watched as the scale of the conspiracy was revealed in vivid detail. The statement was clear and firm. Burkina Faso would no longer tolerate foreign interference in its internal affairs. Traoré's words were powerful, demanding that the international community recognize the sovereignty of his country and condemn the actions of those who sought to undermine it. The response was immediate. Within minutes, social media exploded. People around the world expressed their shock, disbelief, and outrage. News outlets in Europe and Africa began to cover the story, and governments scrambled to respond. Some called for investigations, while others remained silent, unsure of how to react. But in Burkina Faso, the people were watching with mixed emotions. Some cheered, believing they were witnessing a moment of true independence. Others felt fear, unsure of the consequences of such bold actions. But one thing was certain: Ibrahim Traoré had changed the game. As the day went on, the international pressure grew. France, too, responded. Officials denied any wrongdoing and called the footage misleading. They claimed that their actions were meant to support the country's stability. But the damage was done. The world knew the truth, and there was no turning back. Ibrahim Traoré sat in his office, watching the news coverage unfold. His eyes were focused, but his mind was already thinking ahead. The next steps would be crucial. The battle for Burkina Faso's future had only just begun. As the world reacted to the footage, Ibrahim Traoré knew that things were going to change. The truth was out, but now, the hard part began. How would France respond? How would the people of Burkina Faso react to what had been uncovered? And what would the international community do? In the days after the release, the streets of Ouagadougou were filled with a sense of uncertainty. Some people celebrated, proud that their leader had stood up to foreign influence. They saw the release of the footage as a moment of victory, a sign that Burkina Faso was taking control of its future. They waved flags and chanted slogans in support of Traoré, believing that the country was finally free from the grip of foreign powers. But there were others who felt uneasy. The country had already been through so much: conflict, political instability, economic hardship. Now, with the world watching, there was a fear that things could spiral out of control. Some worried about the potential for further violence or a breakdown in relations with France. They didn't know what the next step would be, and they were scared of the unknown. Meanwhile, in Paris, the French government was scrambling to manage the fallout. They had initially denied the claims made by Traoré, but as more pressure mounted, they were forced to acknowledge the situation. The French president gave a public speech, calling the release of the footage unfortunate and misleading. He insisted that France had only tried to help Burkina Faso, offering support during times of need. But the damage was done. The world was beginning to question France's true intentions. The situation was now becoming more complex. European governments were torn between supporting France and backing the right to sovereignty for Burkina Faso. Some countries in Africa expressed solidarity with Traoré, believing that it was time for the continent to stand up and reclaim control from former colonial powers. Others, however, were more cautious, warning that the exposure of this information could lead to instability in the region. In Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré continued to lead with a steady hand. He knew that this was a critical moment for his country. He needed to reassure the people that this wasn't just about confrontation. It was about securing a future where Burkina Faso could thrive on its own terms. He called for unity, reminding everyone that their strength lay in their ability to stand together. "We will not allow anyone to dictate our future," he said in a national address. "This is our country, our land, and our destiny. We will make our decisions and take our path, free from interference." The message was clear, and the people listened. Many felt a sense of pride. For the first time in years, they saw a leader who was standing up for them, someone who was determined to protect the sovereignty of their nation. But even as the people rallied behind him, the pressure continued to mount. Foreign governments continued to demand answers, and France began to pull its diplomatic staff from Burkina Faso. The future of their relationship was uncertain. The decision to stand up to France had been made, but now, Traoré had to decide what to do next. The situation was delicate. He had shown strength, but it was clear that more battles lay ahead. The threat of further foreign influence was still present, and it would take more than just one revelation to secure Burkina Faso's independence. Traoré knew that he would need to act carefully, making sure that his country was prepared for whatever came next. As the days passed, the world continued to watch. Ibrahim Traoré stood firm, knowing that the actions he took now would shape the future of Burkina Faso for generations to come. The weeks after the release of the footage were filled with uncertainty, but also determination. Ibrahim Traoré had taken a bold step in revealing the truth, and now the world was watching to see what would happen next. But no one could deny that Burkina Faso was at a turning point, and the country had the chance to define its future on its own terms. International pressure continued to build. France, though still denying the accusations, had begun to lose influence in Burkina Faso. Many European countries, especially those in Africa, had started to question their relationship with France, wondering if the colonial ties that had once bound them were still relevant. Some leaders spoke out in support of Burkina Faso's right to self-determination, while others stayed silent, unsure of how to react. Meanwhile, back in Ouagadougou, Traoré remained focused on his country. He knew that now, more than ever, his leadership would be tested. The people of Burkina Faso had shown their support, but the road ahead was not easy. The country had suffered from years of conflict, and the threat of further unrest loomed over them. Traoré understood that he had to act carefully, not only to protect the nation's sovereignty, but also to guide it towards stability and prosperity. The first step in that direction was rebuilding the trust of the people. Traoré began to travel around the country, meeting with local leaders, military commanders, and citizens to hear their concerns. He listened to their struggles and shared his vision for a stronger, independent Burkina Faso. He promised that the country would no longer be at the mercy of foreign powers, that they would chart their own course. free from interference. The people responded positively. They saw in Traoré a leader who was not afraid to stand up for them, even when it meant challenging the powerful forces of the world. The rallies and public gatherings grew larger, and more citizens joined in the effort to rebuild their nation. The idea of a truly independent Burkina Faso, one that could make decisions for its own future, resonated deeply with the people. At the same time, Traoré knew that he couldn't do it alone. He began to form alliances with other African countries, seeking support from leaders who shared his vision of a continent free from the influence of former colonial powers. Together, they began to discuss ways to strengthen their economies, improve security, and protect their sovereignty. For the first time in many years, Africa was beginning to look toward the future with hope and unity. As for the situation with France, it remained tense. While diplomatic ties had weakened, Traoré chose to keep the door open for dialogue, hoping that one day France would recognize Burkina Faso's right to stand independently. He understood that the world was changing and old alliances were shifting. But his priority was clear. Burkina Faso would no longer be controlled by anyone. In the months that followed, the country began to slowly recover. The economy began to stabilize as trade relations with other African nations grew. The military, once weakened by foreign influence, started to rebuild its strength with local resources and support. And while there were still challenges ahead, the sense of unity among the people grew stronger every day. The world had witnessed a moment of change in Burkina Faso, but for the people of the country, it was just the beginning. Ibrahim Traoré had shown them that it was possible to stand up to foreign powers and reclaim their sovereignty. Now, they were ready to build a future that was their own, a future that was no longer shaped by others. As Traoré looked out over the city of Ouagadougou one evening, he felt a sense of pride. The road had been long, and the battle was far from over. But for the first time in years, he felt hopeful. Burkina Faso was moving forward, and its future was in its own hands.